Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Massage and Mind podcast. This time with Stephen Harrod Buhner, author about all things herbal, about writing, natural genius, and yeah, you'll see more later. Okay, let's start with psychedelic beers or herbal beers. If you could go a bit into the history of it and then nowadays non-history of psychedelic beers.
Yes. Well, that was a funny book for me to write, and the editor on my first book, Sacred Plant Medicine, the publisher she was working with went through a big shakeup, and she was let go from her job, and she found another one at a press that specializes in beer, the Association of Brewers. And so I had mentioned to her a year or two before that when I was younger I'd been making a lot of herbal beers like spruce beer and things like that. So she began calling me up and saying, please write a book for me. These beer writers are so boring that I have to have a manuscript that's interesting. And it took about a year for her to convince me. So then I began looking into it, and of course, like many things in life, what we think we know about them turns out to be either incredibly superficial or not true once we go deeper into it. And as you and many people know, hopped beers are considered to be what a beer really is. And it turns out that, hopped beers were a fairly late addition to beer. I think it was the German Beer Purity Act. For some reason, I'm forgetting the year.
Like 1518 or something?
Yeah, that's what I thought, around 1500. And that they mandated the use of hops in beer. And so, as I began to look into it, I found there was this magnificent history of using virtually every kind of plant in beer. And in fact, before the Beer Purity Act, it was quite common for a lot of people to have psychotropic or highly inebriating plants in beer. And the most famous of those was called gruit, which the Catholics had a monopoly on. And it turned out there was sort of an anti-drug conflict between the Protestants who, from my experience being a Protestant and knowing many Protestants, they're basically people that know that somewhere somebody's having a good time and they have to put a stop to it. So what happened was there was this big conflict for a while, and then it was really the first drug control law in the history of the human species as far as I can find. But when you go back, you begin to find all of these absolutely marvelous beers that have all of these delicious plants. The flavor range is stunning. The way they age over time is absolutely marvelous. And also, then you begin to get these quite interesting effects on consciousness, not just from the alcohol, but from all of the different kinds of plants that are in there, because many plants do affect our consciousness in at least mild ways. And one of the more interesting things I found is that the word Pilsner in its original meaning meant henbane, and they referred to henbane ales, which are incredibly psychotropic. And so anyway, it's a marvelous world, and I'm so glad so many people around the world now are starting to explore this tradition and make these marvelous beers and getting us away from hopped beers. Because I don't actually like hop beers very much.
So you say there are like many people who actually do this right now, all over the world.
Well, there's, the United States has really sort of seized on that. It's interesting to see where it's happening in the United States. A Dogfish Brewery, for instance, has been going through my book on beer making, and making all kinds of marvelous innovations on it, plus finding ships that sunk in deep cold water and then pulling up beers out of them and analyzing how they were made and remaking them. And then in France, for whatever reason, the whole gruit concept has really taken off and has become a real major exploration there. In Scotland, they've been making traditional heather ales and pine ales, so the whole brewing world is starting to change, and I think that's a good thing.
Wow. And can you also say something about hops and why it might not be a good idea, especially for males?
Yeah, the interesting thing about, one of the things I've learned about myself is that I will never not be ignorant. Okay, it's like when I was younger, I thought, I know many things now, but there's this weird thing that human beings do where we sequester knowledge in all of these separate boxes, and they don't often touch each other. And even though I know better, I continue to do it, which I guess is the definition of living in denial. But anyway, so I had a fairly good knowledge of herbal medicine, of plants and what they did, and then I also had some knowledge of beer making. But it was a very long time before it occurred to me to look at the medicinal impacts of hops in beer. I just had that information sequestered, and even though in my herbal character, I knew hops was the most powerful estrogenic plant on the planet. It contains more estrogen-like chemicals than virtually any other plant that exists. And in fact, in Germany, it's well known for its effects on women's menstrual cycles, and that it can help with menopause experiences. But then looking into it more deeply, there's a well-known phenomenon in England called brewer's droop, which comes from years and years and years of men handling hops, because the constituents in the hops pass through the skin fairly well. And in fact, as I looked into it more deeply, I even found an example of a physician who specializes in hormone replacement therapy for men who are experiencing low testosterone. And in his practice, he began to find that even with direct testosterone injections, if the man was consuming a lot of heavily hopped beer, it would inactivate that. So really drinking massive amount of hops, especially as men grow older and their testosterone levels are already beginning to fall, what happens is they're basically taking estrogen replacement therapy, which is distorting the testosterone-estrogen ratio in their body even more. And so I think, Hildegard of Bingen was the first person, I think, that ever mentioned hops in writing, and I think it was about the year 1215 or something, and she said, hops is not very good for a person. It makes their intestines heavy and their mood melancholy, And it's just, oddly enough, when I wrote about this, to me it was a really fascinating and obvious thing, but I don't think anything that I've written ever has created the kind of controversy that has, because many young men who are fond of IPAs and heavily hopped ales, when they come across that information, it drives them into a frenzy, and so they begin trolling on the internet about it. But nevertheless, I don't consider hops very healthy for men, and that's one of the reasons I like all of these other herbal beers, because they're much better.
Okay. You mentioned IPS. What is it?
It stands for India Pale Ale, and that tends to be the most heavily hopped beers that people normally encounter when they're buying beer in a bar or at a supermarket.
Okay. Yeah, that's I just wanted to talk a little bit about the beer, because I think it's fascinating. There's such a big world behind the beer we know. Maybe you can just mention the name of the book so people can look it up for themselves.
Yeah, it's called Sacred and Herbal Healing Beers. My editor and I spent 6 months trying to find a title, and so that ended up being a really rather unwieldy one. And another really interesting fact that the English were tremendous innovators in herbal medicine back then, and because there wasn't refrigeration and there were so many other things they did, and one of the things they began doing to preserve herbal infusions, basically a really strong tea that's being made for medicinal purposes, is they would make them and then ferment them into ales so they could be stored and not go bad. And one of the fascinating things is the compliance of their patients increased dramatically. I mean, imagine if you're going to your physician and he says, oh, you have some heart problems. Here, drink 3 of these beers every day. I mean, what a great innovation. I love that.
Yeah, it's awesome. Awesome. Another way of administering, like, medicine. So,
yeah, I mean, if medicine tastes good, it's fun, it's a lot easier to take it.
But then it all came suddenly to an halt, like the whole herbal medicine administering.
Yeah, human beings live in the midst of difficulties always, and I've been reading a lot back through ancient Greece and Rome, and there's actually a great deal more material available than I realized, and these patterns of human power conflicts are pretty much identical for many thousands of years. And, excuse me a second. And one of the difficulties that we've run into is that as science became more reductive and more mechanicalistic, there were competing groups within the realm of what were originally called natural philosophers, people that looked at the wildness of the world, at nature, and wanted to understand it better and understand human beings' place within it more. And these very reductive groups, they tend to gain more control over time. One of the ways I think about it is the most pathologically inclined people tend to end up controlling whatever movement was begun for whatever beneficial reason before. And within reductive science, there were many competing healing groups, let's say at the beginning of 1900, but the emphasis, because of the enthusiasm for reductive science and chemistry, they began to move toward, the kind of pharmaceutical medicine that everybody takes for common now. And there was a corresponding belief at the time that human beings started out as basically sort of unthinking animals, and then they became cavemen, and then they became, indigenous peoples, and then they became, ancient peoples, and then slowly they got up to now where they're intelligent people, for the first time in the history of the human species who can actually reason. And we're all pretty much taught that in school, and it's, of course, completely inaccurate. But as part of that, there began to be this, widespread myth or propaganda, as the case may be, about that herbal medicines were raw drugs that superstitious people used, but they couldn't really reason well. But thank goodness now we can, and we can find what's more active in the medicines, and so we can create these amazing, remarkable things, so we can defeat disease for all time, and all human beings will be 1 million years old and will never suffer again. And that's sort of the myth, but in fact, quite the opposite is true. It's turning out that pharmaceuticals, although they are extremely useful and very elegant in a limited range of circumstances, when used widely the way that they are now, they're extremely dangerous to any ecological system that they're introduced into, whether it be the human body or the earth itself. And people are focused a great deal on climate change and things like that, as they should be, and one of the things that's really overlooked is that pharmaceutical pollution is far more dangerous in some ways than many of the things that are widely recognized to be difficult. And so we're seeing a movement back toward actually ecological medicine, which is herbs.
Okay, now speaking of the danger of pharmaceutical medicine, you mentioned in one of your books what's happening in hospitals, especially towards the end of our life, that people get pumped with whatever, or even then in the cemetery, what's happening there. Can you...
The cemetery, nobody ever thinks about that, but in fact, the one thing that people have heard of is the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and the literally trillions of pounds of pharmaceuticals that have been used and put into the environment since World War II. It's stimulated these evolutionary changes in bacteria that are, quote, unrecorded in the history of the planet. And we have this tremendous problem now in that the bacteria, who are far more older than we are, and we've been taught they're really unintelligent, but in fact they're far more intelligent than human beings. Their tool-making capacity far exceeds our own. They have sophisticated culture and linguistics, and they're highly cooperative with each other under most circumstances. So, sort of that story that we've been told, which is that the entire Earth ecosystem, the natural world, is sort of an insentient background, that's kind of stupid and slow, and, we can do pretty much whatever we want without repercussions. We're starting to learn in the worst way possible that that's untrue. So, the resistant bacteria, which are responding to pharmaceutical antibiotics, is the only thing people have really heard of. But, another really major problem is hormone replacement therapies, which are causing sex changes in hundreds of different species of fish and animals, and then even further antidepressants, which are extremely common in the United States, are affecting neural structures throughout the planet itself, because the thing that most people don't get is all life forms on this planet have very similar physiology and functioning, so whatever pharmaceutical we make for a human being is going to affect everything that it comes into contact with. And the reason we have to take medicine throughout the day is that our body excretes it out, and it goes into wastewater streams and affects everything, and it's not fixed by water treatment plants. And then you get to cemeteries in which, at the end of life, many people are pumped full of massive amounts of pharmaceuticals in an attempt to stave off death. And then, despite the fact that most people go through an embalming process, the tissues are still filled with these pharmaceuticals, which then over time begin to leach into all of the ground systems around cemeteries, and then it's like a toxic waste dump of pharmaceuticals that begins to affect everything over time. So, that's what I mean about this kind of inevitable ignorance in the human species, and that, we think we're doing good and saving life is good, and all of us pretty much accept that as true, but we very rarely look at the side effects of our good intentions. And in one sense, the human species is being confronted by an unwillingness to think more deeply about any of their behaviors, including the ones that they think are honorable and good and ethical. And we face a really difficult time now, and it's not really escapable. So we're in the midst of paradigm shifts, and those are never comfortable.
Okay, so to rehash, you say an antidepressant is also, for example, influencing a tree.
Oh yes, very much. I mean, one of the things that it's extremely difficult for human beings to understand, and it's most difficult for people raised in the Western liberal democracies, because their school system is founded on a belief that human beings are unique, that they're different than all other life form on the planet, and that what sets them apart is their brain, because it's so much bigger and more functional than everybody else. But what's really true is it's not our brain that's important, but the neural network that's inside the brain. Our brain is just the organ that holds that neural net. But when you start looking at the world without the bias preconception that we're taught in school, for instance, trees have an identical neural network. They use the same neurochemicals we do, and that is their root system. And they have synapses and neurons and memory and language. They're just exactly like us. They're just a different structural species. And the earth is what they use. They don't need a brain. They use the earth, the soil itself, to hold their neural network. So in many instances, that neural net can grow far larger and be much more expansive than the human brain. And what happens when antidepressants, and this is just a small example, I mean, there's everywhere you go in the Earth ecosystem, you'll find neural networks of varying sizes and extent, some of which far exceed our own. And so antidepressants, which are being taken, and of course the millions and millions of tons as well, and excreted into the environment and thrown away and all of that sort of thing, once they get into the ecosystem, they're not biodegradable. Very few pharmaceuticals are biodegradable very easily, and so they begin to affect plants and plant function just as well as they do human beings. Only when they begin to really look at depth at it, what they found is it interferes with neural network development, with the healthy development of those neural networks, and with their healthy functioning. So, you know, there's a lot more going on with the effect of antidepressants on the developing neural networks in the young, or even in some mature species, that's just not being looked at all, except in the most cursory, very beginning stages.
So there's like almost no conscience about it in the pharmaceutical industry.
Well, the pharmaceutical industry doesn't have a conscience. I mean, everybody should know that. Their primary function, and I'm not sure they have consciousness either, as well as not having a conscience, but their primary function is to leverage human fear of disease and then make a lot of money off of selling a product that will address whatever that fearsome thing is. That's their job. It is not to help human beings. It is not the alleviation of pain or suffering. It's to make as much money as they can. And in a sense, the Western world has made kind of a deal with the devil, because these people are not motivated by any moral sense at all, and yet we've come to depend upon them to deal with our fear of death or our fear of suffering and disease. And in consequence, we use way more of these pharmaceuticals than is really necessary or is good for us. So, and of course, especially in the United States, the Western medical system here is completely enthralled to the pharmaceutical companies. They don't know any other way of healing are working. And so and we've been trained in this country anyway to distrust most other forms of healing or medical practice. So people get pulled into that system because their fear is leveraged. They're given pharmaceuticals that often do more harm than good, which then contribute even further to the ecological disruption. So we're in a cycle that's very difficult to stop.
And what can you say about the idea that's being pushed from the pharmaceutical side, like the idea of disease? Like
the idea of what?
The idea of disease, that it's all like germs and virus. And
the idea of disease. Oh, well, that's really hilarious because, AIDS, HIV, one of the primary things that AIDS taught the medical world here, even though they fought bitterly against the recognition, is that disease depends a great deal more on the health of the immune system than it does the idea that they had before. And pretty much, here's the idea everybody has absorbed, and it's especially true in the United States. So we're all just walking along, happy, innocent children, people, just trying to lead, happy lives, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere comes a vicious, horrible, human-hating thing called bacteria, and it gets into us, and it destroys our whole life, and instead of having a happy life, we've been, attacked by this vicious predator, which isn't very smart, but yet we can figure out what to do and kill it so that we'll never get sick again. And that's sort of, in one form or another, what probably 90% of the people in the United States believe, because they see commercials about it on TV all the time, they read articles about it in the newspapers all of the time, and that's sort of a basic belief system. But, we're starting to see when bacteria begin to develop resistance and they begin to show, in a way that was not ignorable anymore, tremendous intelligence, adaptability, and tool-making capacity and cooperation. That began to sort of change the concept a bit. And then as more and more stealth infections began to emerge, that changed it even more. The stealth infection group for me is, Lyme disease bacteria, and there's probably about 15 or 20 associated bacteria in that group that are transmitted by ticks and a number of other organisms. And it's particularly difficult in Germany and a number of places in Europe. It's become a huge problem. Eastern Europe, the northern regions mostly. It's a severe problem in France now, and in England it's a growing problem. And the problem with these stealth infection bacteria is that they're extremely clever and very ancient. And so when they get into the body, the traditional response from reductive pharmaceutical practitioners is to just kill them with antibiotics. But the problem is these bacteria don't tend to respond very well to antibiotics. And so it's forcing an entirely different approach to understanding them and treating them, which is, in fact, it's much more subtle, difficult to explain in a short synopsis, but basically to use the sophistication of plant medicines to shut down the way that they invade the body and then cause damage in the cellular tissue, while at the same time using herbs to enhance immune function. And, I've spent many years, over 12 or 13 years, focused on stealth infections like that, and they basically, you can see people that have been in wheelchairs and abandoned by the medical system here who, with a proper understanding of what's going on and just a few simple herbs, they'll be walking around and their health completely restored anywhere from a month to 6 months after they start. So again, we're in the midst of a paradigm shift between that old, basically kind of insulting, arrogant, hubristic, approach that humans have had toward the natural world to one where we're understanding it in a very different way and beginning to work more in partnership with the earth rather than as dominating adversaries.
Okay, so then now let's talk about how we can get more into this partnership thing. And okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
And maybe if you can start out with centers of perception.
Well, one of the things that happened, when reason arose during the Enlightenment as sort of a primary approach to the world, it was being done to deal with the oppressive dogmatism of the Christian church in the Western world, in Europe especially, and they needed to be some sort of a counteract, a different approach to the world that had some sort of sound foundation that people could point to and develop. And that's how it began. But at the time that happened, the original people in the Enlightenment, they didn't in any way think that reason should be dissociated from the other human capacities that we all have. Our feeling sense, the response of our hearts to what the world was telling us, our imagination, our moral conscience, our, just all of these other aspects of the self were considered integral, and they just wanted to use reason as sort of a counteractant to unexamined dogma. And that was great for a long time, but what happened slowly over time, and if you begin to look at the Enlightenment up to now, you begin to see how as time went on, the rationalists who were the most fanatical about it began to actively work to separate out every other human capacity from the exercise of what they were calling reason. And so we ended up at a place where this dissociated mentation was considered to be the highest aspect or the highest expression of reason. But the problem becomes once that occurs, when you've dissociated reason from all other human capacities, it begins to become sociopathological almost immediately, because reason itself has no moral compass, and that's how you can get scientists who will make the gas ovens at Auschwitz and have no moral twinge, are, that people can engage in massive ecological disruption through the use of reason without any moral twinge. So the thing that's slowly beginning to happen is people are beginning to rebel against that really unhuman or anti-human abuse of reason, and they're beginning to bring back the response of their heart to what's presented to the senses. There's very few of us who as children did not feel the aliveness of the world or the wonder of the world, or experience plants as living beings that were our kindreds, that had their own life stories to tell. And that sense of wonder is generally destroyed for most people as they go through the schooling system. But what we're finding in the ecologists, especially the deep ecologists, the people that are working closely with nature, there's a feeling basis of, they feel a kind of violation of something good and necessary and alive and that has a givingness toward human beings that really needs to be protected. And so that's what I mean. We have a paradigm shift now away from what you might call the tyranny of pure reason in the way they've defined it, into something more human. And the first step of this really is to begin to pay attention to what your feeling tells you. That we've all walked into a restaurant one time or another that we hadn't been in before, and we sort of stop and go, this place feels weird, let's leave. And that's what I mean by the feeling sense, the response of the heart. It tells you something important about what's going on in your environment. And that, and then the second thing is to reanimate the world. I mean, once we look at the world and we think of the earth as Gaia, as a living being, it becomes very hard to be careless. That reanimate dynamic engenders a sense of relationship and caring. So to me, all plants are living beings that deserve respect, just like other human beings. Bacteria are living beings that deserve respect. So what's being reestablished is a sense of kindredness with all of the life verse, where we sit in a common council of beings together. And that is the way out of our dilemma, but it's not going to happen without a great deal of difficulty.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also hard, like this feeling, to awaken this feeling response when you grew up in a city. You've never seen like plants or like a forest, no?
Well, it's true that the feeling sense becomes atrophied from misuse, and not just from misuse, but from being actively denigrated by rationalists throughout most of our life. And so people end up very confused about what it means. But probably the most common expression where people can find it probably in two areas most commonly. One is just the aesthetic sensibility. There's not a person alive in a city who hasn't walked along and seen a really ugly building that they didn't like, and at the same time seen buildings that possess some sort of a luminous or wondrous aspect, a beautiful aspect that touches them in a way. That's really their feeling response, responding to what the exterior world is presenting to them. And also people experience this commonly with their pets. People that love puppies and kittens, they know beyond doubt that there's this exchange of touch, of a caring touch between themselves and their pets, that the pets recognize it, and there's this moment of what the ancient Greeks would have called a soul exchange, where there's that moment where you first see each other and you just take in this deep breath and you go, oh, and then some energy goes out of your body into the puppy, and some energy comes out of the puppy into you, and it feels a certain way, and then the puppy runs over and you begin touching and hugging each other. You know, that's one of the most important experiences a human being can have, but there's no word for it in the English language, and in very few other languages is it recognized. You know, the Greeks called it thesis, which was recognized that moment of touch and exchange, which is the root of our word aesthetic, so there's still some of that in there. But yes, when most people in the Western world, when they think of the colonization of third world countries, one of the things that they don't realize hardly ever is that we, growing up in the first world, have been the longest colonized of anybody. And taking care of that colonization, responding to it and changing the colonization of our interior world is very difficult. And the first place to start is the reclaiming the feeling sense. And I mean, I saw there was a great sign a French protester was carrying a number of years ago, you know, and she said, the first act of disobedience is contemplation. And the French, I love that. But really, when the feeling response, when you begin to reclaim it, immediately what happens is a kind of contemplation, because you have to begin to figure out what your feeling response is telling you, and to begin to educate it, to allow it to become as mature as the thinking processes you've been trained in. And it takes a long time, and it takes the willingness to know that the way the self is in this moment, that there's something wrong and it must be changed. And in essence, you go back to school and you let the world start teaching you about itself through its impact on your feeling sensibility. It takes a great humility to do that, but yet the rewards are tremendous, because that sense of isolation and alienation and depression that so many in the Western world struggle with, the more the feeling sense is engendered and developed, the more connection one has to the world, and the less alone one feels, and the less depressed.
Yeah, for me it was also like, because I was reading Ensouling Language, your book, the last weeks again. And so I was immersing myself more and more into the feeling sense capacity. And it feels like when I'm in a room and then I let me be touched by the meanings and the feelings and the persons and whatever is in the space in the room, then it's like I'm less dissociated. Like I'm taking more a step into the room to be there.
Right, and it's automatic. It's not, I mean, that's wonderful that you're doing that and that you're noticing that. It's literally, once you start rekindling the feeling sense, it's an immediate process of becoming more present and more centered in the body, more, and just in a way more happy. It's, you know, I love the way the American poet Robert Bly put it when he said, human beings have become isolated in their own house. They look out of the windows from time to time at a world with which they can have no meaningful contact, because they've removed soul from the raven, from the owl, from the stone, from the entire exterior world. And so what this reclamation of the feeling sense does is it allows the person to walk outside of their own house, and that sense of isolation immediately begins to disappear. And it's what we do then is we begin healing the ecological wound that is inside our own hearts, inside our own psyche. And of course, it begins with a single step, but the journey of this process of the re-education of the soul, it really never ends. But your description of it is perfect, because as soon as you do that, you become, the first thing that happens is dissociation begins to diminish.
And when you're talking about going out of your house, you might also encounter moments of Duende.
Right, and that's the great poet Garcia Lorca came up with that term, Duende, which is, there's these moments that bypass the rational mind, these moments of tremendous feeling, and he talked about it when hearing great musicians are, hearing somebody speak great poetry or language. And, you know, because language is just a container for meaning, it's nothing in and of itself, and our job as writers is to get as much meaning as we can into the language, so that when another human mind touches it, it sort of breaks the surface tension of the word, and this great meaning then spills out into the other person, who in that moment gets caught up in an experience of the meaning that's touched them. And at the most powerful moments, it begins to reverberate inside the self, and for a moment the chattering mind just stops. You're caught up in this massive experience and contemplation of this great meaning that's touched you. That same event happens as we wander through the world. If once we leave the dissociation behind, we walk out, and if we're lucky enough, we go into a forest and we stumble upon a great old growth tree, and for a moment, and we just catch a glimpse of it, and we turn and we're caught up in wonder, and we breathe in. As the Greek said, there's that moment of breathing, of inspiration. For the ancient Athenians, inspiration came from the world itself and was always accompanied by a breathing in like that. And that's a moment of Duende from the natural world. And as human artists, we struggled, all of us, to try to create that moment in language, if we're writers, as poets are, in paintings, are in music. And that experience of Duende is one of the most moving of all human experiences. And I like to think of my life as staggering from one moment of Duende to the next, because it's a lot more enjoyable than just, it's one of the greatest experiences a human being can have, and the world's filled with it, so why not become an explorer and seek it out?
And then when you have this moment of being touched and this great realization or whatever, you also have a new pair of eyes to see the world with.
And that's one of the things the great German poet Goethe talked about. He said, anything rightly seen unlocks a new faculty of soul. And what happens in those moments when we're touched by meaning like that, it always, some new organ of perception in us begins to develop. We begin to be aware that the most important things in life are invisible, that it takes a different part of the self to perceive them and work with them. The rational mind is a literalist. It's very linear. It can't see many of the most important things that happen in life. It doesn't understand love because it has no feeling sense. It doesn't understand the touch of Duende because it has no capacity to experience those moments. The rational mind is a tremendous servant, but it's the worst possible master that human beings could possibly have. You're right, what happens is these different perceptual capacities begin to emerge in us as we are touched by more and more things from the world like that. And literally in that process, the world begins, as the great English poet Keats said, the world is the place of soul-making. And in fact, that's exactly what happens as we move from one moment of Duende to the next, to the next. The world begins shaping us, forming us in this way where we become uniquely ourselves, or the soul of us becomes alive, and in essence, we become different than we were, but much more than we were, because these things from the wildness of the world, these intelligences now live inside of us, and once that happens, it can never be forgotten. The deep self can never forget it, and we become, in its essence, to become subsumed by that which we've conquered, as it should be. We should be subsumed by it.
And I also had the thought, during the last weeks, that Duende might be, for one, the opposite of trauma, and also an antidote.
And what was the last thing?
Antidote?
Antidote. Yes, very much so. Part of what happens to us, because reason is such a tiny part of the human being, as people are schooled and all of these other capacities of the self are taken away, usually through a kind of shaming process or a denigration or a discounting of it, and we become narrower and narrower. The 360-degree luminous personality with which we're born begins to diminish, so there's hardly any of us left. And so there's this depression. And in that process, all of us experience trauma of some sort, okay? All of us are harmed somehow by other human beings. The trauma may be less for some and much greater for others, but it creates a wound in the self. And what becomes important after that is the story. We're trapped in sort of a rational story loop that has a psychological reference, and most of that trauma is not solvable through a straight psychological orientation. The worse the trauma, the least able it is for a reductive rationalist explanation to help it. But once we walk into the world, we begin to walk into the place myth is formed, to the imaginal world, to these moments of Duende and direct communication of meaning from the intelligences with which we're surrounded. And those things that touch us do so for a reason. Why should we be touched by one thing but another? Why should we choose to go down this street rather than the other street, into this part of the forest instead of another? It's because some deep part of us knows we need something that those particular steps will lead us to over time. And one thing that happens after a while is this deep trust of the soul-making process that we're involved in through our marriage to the wildness of the world. And you're right, once those things come in, they are a counteractant to the trauma. Not only are they a counteractant, but they provide a mythological explanation for why the trauma was there and why it needed to happen for us to become who we are. The trauma then, instead of a wound or a damage in our structure that creates a foundational weakness, becomes a major source of strength and our life work. It literally is that touch of the world. You're right, it literally is the antidote to the depressive narrowing of the human experience in which most of us are raised.
Mm-hmm. And when we speak of narrow human experience, also imagination comes to my mind. That's like boundless. And
right, I mean, one of the problems that we have is most of our human attributes that have been part of us since we emerged out of the ecological matrix of this planet. They're important. They're ecological innovations of very long standing. Most, if not all, organisms on this planet have exactly the same capacities we do. We just don't recognize it. I mean, one of my favorite kind of jokey sayings is that will we ever recognize intelligent life in the universe? We can't even see it on our own planet, because we're so bound up. And one of the things that is crucial is the sense of imagination. Now, to a rationalist, what imagination means, and most people have been taught this, it's a fancy of the mind that has no relation to reality. However, in the development of the feeling sense, what Goethe called heart perception, that ability of feeling the world and thinking through the heart, and that the heart has its own imagination, and it can tap into what many people have referred to as the imaginal realm. The great Islamic scholar Henry Corbin actually talked about that. Goethe talked about it in length, and many people have, that when we approach the natural world thinking through our heart rather than through our brain, and most people, I need to put a comment here, most people in the Western world have been taught that the heart is sort of it's a mechanical pump, but yeah, it's got some maybe the seat of some rude emotions and things, but that's a part of the colonization of ourselves, of the denigration of our very humanity, and of that sense, the heart can engage in sophisticated reasoning and thinking that far exceeds the brain. And that, when you start to read the stories of the great artists and scientists, all of them say that's how they got to their understanding of the world, not through the brain, which is simply kind of an organic computing tool. When we go out and then we start to experience these moments of Duende and the touch of the world on us, as your capacity for thinking through the heart becomes more sophisticated, there's these tremendous moments where through the imaginal sensing of the heart you become aware of connections between supposedly separate things. You know, and one of the ways that this is described is a kind of a dream state. Even Crick and Watson, when they talked about understanding DNA and the double helix, what they said was it came in a dream. They were just thinking, and all of a sudden this dream emerged in which they saw it in the complete gestalt of the thing. And that's what the imaginal sensing of the heart, the imagination of the heart does. It gives us gestalts of understanding that can't be reduced to linear steps by the rational mind. Einstein spoke of it continually, and that's one of the things science has lost. They've abandoned the heart and lost the root of real science.
Okay. And to reshape it for people listening, it's like a little bit like a journey you take with the feeling sense and re-engaging with the heart. It's like at first you might go out and just look at something and ask yourself like, how does it feel? But then you stay with it for longer time, and it's like, and then it's going deeper.
Right. I mean, that's exactly how it works. It's odd that a lot of the ways or approaches we can use to change our internal world and our relationship to the external world, and any kind of work we might do for the natural world, our ecological work, our social justice work, or whatever, the very first step, the very first moment of disobedience is to just stop and ask yourself, how does this feel? You know, I use how does it feel because that phrasing works best for me, but I spent perhaps 20 years of my life every day for many hours everywhere I went asking myself, how does it feel? How does this pencil feel? How does this book feel? How does the story I read feel? How does this tree feel? How does this field feel? Because our feeling sense, what its function is to allow us access to meaning. You know, so all of us have had the experience of coming home to our spouse and saying, "Hi, honey, how are you?" And our spouse goes, "Fine." Well, we know in that moment that she or he is not fine. And in fact, if we take that communication at surface value, we're going to have a big argument really soon, because form and essence, the meaning inside form and the form itself, often have very little relationship to each other. We can see or find a great tree in a forest that our rational mind tells us is remarkable, but our feeling sense will tell us there's something wrong with it. You know, there's some meaning in it that we're perceiving that lets us know there's something out of whack. Or we go to a party and, you know, there's all these people there, and our rational mind is telling us that it's a wonderful event, but some deeper part of ourself, the feeling effect that we're getting, we're going, there's something wrong about this place. And that feeling is the first touch of meaning on us that tells us there's something we must pay attention to. And it's really our contemplation afterward that we sit with it and begin to unlock the mysteries of its meaning. And that allows us deeper access to the world. It's very simple. How does it feel? It feels like this. And there's quite often not going to be a word to capture that feeling, because feelings are as varied and as subtle as the thousands of colors an artist might use in their palette. And slowly we begin to unlock those meanings, and that only comes from contemplation.
Mm-hmm. And then what I wanted to go into is also analogical thinking or thought as a tool to work with all of this.
Right. Analogical thinking is what begins to happen as you're learning to think through the heart. So that's the first step of how does it feel, and then spending time in contemplation with the meaning that comes. What you begin to do then is you begin to immerse yourself in a different kind of perceptual sensing and reasoning. And the more you do it, then the more natural it becomes. And there starts to be these moments. They quite often happen early on, but it's like, the first time you ride a bicycle where you get that balance point and then you yell, "I've got the balance point," and then you fall off your bike because you've, taken your focus away. And slowly there's this sort of point of balance you get where you're in that way of thinking or perceiving, and you just stay in it. And you start going, because the interesting thing about the experience of meaning like that, if you experience a meaning through your feeling sense, and you stay with it in this period of contemplation, this most amazing thing happens. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, your attention will be drawn to something else automatically, somehow inherent in the thing that's touched you. There's a golden thread of meaning that goes to something else. And so you allow your perception to follow that thread to the other thing. And it's almost an instantaneous jump. You go over to the other thing, and it has a different kind of feeling impact, a different kind of meaning. And you'll be with that for a while, and then something else emerges of its own accord into your awareness. And you follow that. And the thing is that all of these things, even though they seem extremely unrelated to the rational mind, in this deeper sense, they are related. And as you begin to follow them one to the next, to the next, to the next, what begins to happen is a kind of an understanding of the essential nature, the threads of connection. And you find yourself then in the midst of analogical thinking, because there is no easy way to reduce this to a linear process. You're engaged in a kind of a nonlinear, holistic, perceptual thinking and sensing. And once you do that, you begin to have understandings of the world that seem to emerge of their own accord. And that's the kind of science Einstein was talking about, or Barbara McClintock, or Luther Burbank, or many of the people I've mentioned in my books. And the neat thing about it is that it produces a kind of pleasurable ecstasy in the soul to think that way, to understand. It's not a monologue, but it's rather a dialogue between the self and the world, in which all of this understanding emerges seemingly of its own accord.
Okay. So, if you have something in your life that's somehow making an impression on you, giving you some kind of feeling, then you might want to stay with it, follow it, maybe even find like your life's purpose in it.
Well, right. I mean, it's like, I think all of us have moments the thing is, usually only children and artists tend to follow those things, they're the only ones that got time, in a sense. But the patience of contemplation is crucially important in this. The willingness to understand you've been touched by something exceptional, and then being willing to stop your life and turn and face it and begin to ask yourself, what is the meaning in this thing? Why has it touched me? And it can be anything. Part of the problem with our Western orientation is we've become, enamored of the heroic. But it's often the simplest things that lead us to ourself. I would go hear as many people that I considered remarkable people as I could throughout the course of my life. And, so I remember I would hear somebody talk that I was very impressed by, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, our Joan Halifax, our Buckminster Fuller, and they would be speaking and I'd be listening, and all of a sudden there would be this look on their face that I didn't understand, that somehow some part of me said that's important. It would have a feeling to it, and I would spend sometimes many years thinking about it. Other times, I would be walking in the woods, and for some reason, a particular stone or a particular plant would seem to have a different quality to it than all of the others around it. For me, plants were the big thing that pulled me into the heart of the world, as they do many people. It was true for Goethe, for Barbara McClintock, for many people. And for some reason, one plant would sort of stand out from the other, and it would pull my attention to it. James Hillman, the great Jungian psychotherapist, said it's a moment of what the ancient Greeks called notitia, the attentive noticing of the soul. And so I would allow that thing, I would turn toward it, allow everything else to sort of fade from my awareness and focus on it, and begin to allow the feeling that the thing was giving, that my heart was responding to. I was having this feeling emerge inside of me, and I would allow it to grow stronger and stronger, to wonder, why has this thing touched me so much more deeply than all these other things? And then that process would occur. It's really, that's the first step that begins to take you. It's the process of soul making that takes you to yourself, and that, for I believe, a lot of people, leads them to where their true chance of greatness lies, to the soul work that they're here to do in this lifetime. It's not something that you can explain to a rationalist. They don't understand it, but yet those of us who have followed it, what ends up happening is life becomes the most astonishing adventure in which we unfold with the world itself, in concert with the world. And once you've experienced what this is like, the exhortations of rationalists begin to they become really the foolish thoughts of people who have lost themselves a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. And I see nowadays also many people are drawn to spirituality, but I don't know if is it also possible that it is dissociated from a feeling sense?
Well, the religion is quite often dissociated from the feeling sense. Spirituality, on the other hand, is quite often connected to the feeling sense, and most powerful religious movements over history have tended to emerge out of these moments of epiphany or duende or visionary experience that were quite powerful. Really, the source of vision comes from the world itself, from the outside, from invisibles that touch us, and those lend us direction for our life. If you look into indigenous cultures around the world with any depth, you'll find that visionary experience is a normal part of cultures who have always experienced the world as animate and aware and alive. And there's a natural polytheistic spirituality that emerges out of those experiences, because what the feeling sense finds immediately is that everything is ensouled in the world. Everything, all phenomena are ensouled. All phenomena can communicate and touch human beings in this way. And that, so there's this tremendous reverence for life, not only a life out there, but for the self. For our bodies are quite often disparaged and discounted as sort of this matter that carries the only important part of us around, our brain. You know, many people are fairly abusive to their own bodies, just the way they are abusive to the physical world exterior to those bodies. But yet, once you start doing this, there's a very natural spiritual sense that begins to emerge that doesn't have to be grandiose. It's just sort of the way the world works. And there's a natural ecological sensitivity that emerges too. Once you're aware of this, you want to treat your own body with great reverence, as well as the bodies of everything out there. And you know, many of the Western world's religions are quite hostile to the sense of an animate universe, because there's a natural polytheistic sensibility that emerges, and it puts it in conflict with the monocentric beliefs of whether it's the Judeo-Christian Islamic triad or whether it's science, which is in and of itself a monocentric religious form. So there is a real spirituality that emerges, which I think is by its very nature associative rather than dissociative.
Okay. What you also can say, I think, is like in the Western culture, when you have something like visionary experiences, you're more likely to be thrown into a mental ward.
That's really true. We don't have, because of that sort of, you know, Judeo-Christian Islamic scientific grouping, it doesn't have a place for visionary experience. To the rational mind that's dissociated, anything like that appears very abnormal, and they have attributed to fancies of mind. So, you know, artists to some extent are recognized as having a certain kind of visionary experience, and they sort of have a niche in which to be now. But then you think about Van Gogh, who was not recognized in his time, who I think sold only one painting in his entire life, and yet now he's recognized for his visionary genius, and his paintings sell for hundreds of millions of dollars. But yet when people with visionary experience emerge in their own time, unless they're extremely careful to paint themselves the same color as everybody else in their culture, they begin to seem eccentric and then very different, and then often quite fearful. I mean, one of the real root understandings that I've come to after many years is that cultures, societies quite often tell everybody you must not extend consciousness further than we want it to go. And that's part of the reason for the prohibition of inebriating beers and highly psychotropic substances of any sort, because once you begin to extend awareness and consciousness far outside the normal boundaries, it begins to threaten the sort of concrete stabilized structure of a culture or society, the assumptions that those cultures have begin to seem morally suspect. They begin to be recognized as having very little relation to the exterior world. And so those people are, more socially dysfunctional they are, the more seriously they're labeled as schizophrenic and put into institutions, are, crazy in one sort or another and discounted. But all indigenous cultures prior to our time, and even the Greeks and the Romans, they had niches that recognized that certain people would become those kind of visionaries and were necessary to the health of the culture. We're really the Western world is the first culture in the history of human habitation of this planet that doesn't have a recognized niche for that. We're the first culture in the history of human habitation of the planet that thinks it is crazy for our ancestors to come to us in dreams and help us with a solution to our problems. The first culture that thinks that talking to a plant or a plant talking to a human being is in essence insane. But then what you look at what we've created in a way you might say we kill the spirituality of nature, and now nature is about to repay the compliment.
So we're ahead of interesting times.
Yes, we have. And we're in the midst of interesting times, and they're only going to get more interesting because the old paradigm, and all of the structures built on that reductionistic, monocentric paradigm are beginning to crumble. I mean, we see it in the crumbling of infrastructure in the United States, and whenever there's a huge problem like Hurricane Katrina or something, rational structures are unable to efficiently deal with it. We see the collapse of political structures that had a great deal of stability for the liberal West. It's happening in Europe too. There's a tremendous loss of faith in liberal structures which were based on this sort of rational humanism, which itself had become corrupted by the rational reductionism. And so we see this whole trembling of the entire edifice of Western structure now, which of course is terrifying to everybody. We're not that different than elephants who can sense an earthquake coming hours before it happens. All of us are sensing this tremendous earthquake that is moving through the structure of the world, of the paradigm in which we've all been raised and upon which our societies rest. And the problem is neither the rationalist paradigm nor the monocentric religious paradigms that are here have the ability to deal with what's happening. So we see people, as Buckminster Fuller once said, human beings have a monological propensity for one-picture answers. The only problem is that one-picture answers do not exist. And so we see people seizing on these one-picture answers. Oh, we'll get rid of immigrants, or we'll get rid of invasive plants, or, we'll do this. And they all try to institute this one thing that they think will return the structure to some sort of safety and stability. But in fact, it's the structures themselves that are creating the instability. And we are going to be forced to adapt in a way that we haven't had to do for a very long time. And I think people's sensibility that something is seriously wrong, that we're in for great difficulty, and that fear, that is it's telling us something important. And so what I encourage everybody to do when I speak is to pay attention to your feeling sense, follow where it leads you, but also trust your own inherent genius to tell you where your true chance of greatness lies, the place that you need to become active, the thing you need to do. It's not necessarily in the movement of large numbers of people saying we have to have this sort of change that the change can actually happen. It is in millions of people following their own genius and letting solutions emerge out of that touch between themselves and the world that's going to lead us out of this place into something more stable, something more non-linear, something more realistic.
Yeah, I also want to come back at the end, like, to the individual, and also want to thank you because I was working a lot with the imagination the last 2 years, but then I realized, yeah, you have to feel it, what you imagine, and like this combination is for me what is like, yeah, what's workable for a future.
It is workable for the future. I mean, we become travelers in time. We see future possibilities, future potentials because of that touch between ourselves and the world and our imaginal sensing and the genius with which we were born. I mean, to the ancient Greeks and Romans, that would be a daemon or a genius that was inserted into us at the moment of birth that would tell us where our soul work would reside. And through that touch, these things emerge that are our unique contribution. And those things, oddly enough, they're like we give them some form and drop them into the world, and they create these ripples that move through the world. And millions of us doing that is going to create this incredible, amazing thing that in some ways has never been known before in the history of human habitation of Earth. It's very exciting, even as at the same time it's scary because of the falling apart process that we're now beginning to experience.
Yeah, so it's like an open-ended road.
That it is.
Okay, you want to put out your website or something for?
Well, if people just, get on Google or whatever they use and type in my name, B as in boy, U-H-N-E-R, Stephen, and it will be about the first thing that comes up for them.
Okay, Stephen. I think that's it, more or less. A lot to digest and feel and think about. And I want to thank you a lot.
Thank you so much, Christoph, for taking the time to do this today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was amazing talking to you.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.